Okay, let's talk about latency. I get a lot of questions about this. So what latency is it's a delay in between the sound going into your microphone and the sound coming out of your speakers. You can hear latency in something like, let's say you were singing and then listening to headphones coming out of your computer. Okay, you might hear that the sound coming out of your computer gets to you a little bit late than when you sing in. If you're trying to record, this is maddening, right? This will screw up your whole performance. So you want to get rid of that latency. Now, latency comes from all the processing that has to happen, right? Your microphone is going to take your analog sound, it's going to run it down the cable, so that takes time. It's going to go into your audio interface, which then has to do a lot of really complicated math to it. That takes time. Then send that down the USB or whatever it happens to be cable, which takes time, into your computer, which then has to process it, which takes time. Then into live, which then has to process it. That takes time. Then it has to send it back out to your audio interface, again, down a wire, that takes time. Your audio interface has to convert it to an analog signal, which takes time, and then send it through another cable, which takes time, to your speakers, which then have to play it. So all of that adds up to a couple of milliseconds. This all happens very, very fast, but it takes time. So we need to make that amount of time as small as possible. So in our preferences for Ableton, we have some settings for latency that will let you deal with it. Okay. The biggest one is buffer size. So without getting too technical, the buffer size is kind of the chunk that Live is going to use to process the sound. How big of a chunk is it going to use? In terms of audio quality, you want this to be kind of big as possible. But in terms of recording, the bigger it is, the more time it takes for it to process. So for latency, you want it to be as small as possible. Okay? So I could just set it to 32 samples. However, that can compromise the quality of my playback. I don't think it compromises the quality of my recording, actually, just what I'm hearing back from it. So I could record it at 32 samples of a buffer size, but then when I'm playing back and editing, change it to a higher sample rate. I think I could do that, and it would help. But what you really want to do is play around with these settings and find the sweet spot. 512 for me is pretty good. I have a very fast computer, so I can record this and essentially hear very, very little latency in doing this. So you're going to play around with this. When you're recording, lower samples is going to be faster. However, you're going to start to hear it. Driver compensation is like if your audio interface, it has a certain amount of latency built into it, you can basically dial it in here and it doesn't change anything, is my understanding, but it will just tell Live how much latency is happening. So if I say there's 10 milliseconds latency, or more likely 4 milliseconds latency built into my audio interface, and I know that by just looking up the documentation, then I can report it here so that Ableton knows that our overall latency right now is 103 milliseconds. Well, on the playback end, it's not really bothering me, so whatever's going on here, I'm not really hearing it. This input latency is the one I really care about. That's the one that's going to get you that effect of hearing something that's not, of recording something at a different, and not hearing it back instantly. So play around with this. Lower is better for recording, higher is better for playback.